Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this video you're watching right now is usually something that I only send to paying subscribers for my newsletter. What happens is once every 2 weeks, I host a Zoom call with subscribers to my newsletter, and we'll pick a topic in advance. It might be about how to grow your newsletter, how to monetize with subscriptions, how to build an online community. We'll schedule the call at a certain time. I'll recruit some people from the outside who are actually experts on that topic to join the call with us as well. And we'll basically just start, and for an entire hour, we'll just talk through that topic. It's not me lecturing the entire group. It's not just a one-way interview or anything like that. It's truly an open discussion where we ask each other questions, we contribute, we give our expertise, and it's pretty incredible. Like today's video was about podcast discovery, how to drive audience to your podcast, and we just had some amazing participants in this video. We had the host of one of the most popular tech podcasts in the world. We had the head of Macmillan Podcast, which is a huge podcast network. We had the head of the VP of marketing for a podcast network that told her story of how she drove over 1 million downloads to a podcast. The discussion was just great, and I really enjoyed it. And usually what happens is I record these office hours calls, and then I take that recording and I upload it to YouTube as an unlisted video, so it's not publicly available. And then I send it out to my list of paying subscribers who weren't able to actually attend the meeting. So even if there's a meeting that you're not able to attend, you still get some benefit from it. So anyway, I just wanted to release this episode for free just to show everybody the amazing discussion that's going on these calls, so that if this looks like something that you want to participate, you want to get these kinds of insights, you want to do this kind of networking with very successful people within the media industry, you have to becoming a paying subscriber to my newsletter. And I put a link in this video. Look down in the description. There's a link where you can get 10% off for the first year. It costs a measly $50 a year. You should definitely do it. As you'll see when you watch this video, and I've had people tell me anecdotally, is like the level of discussion on these videos is better than what they get when they attend panels at major media and tech conferences, where they're paying hundreds or sometimes even thousands of dollars to attend. So the benefits are tremendous. So we're going to jump right into it, but if this looks even remotely interesting to you, like you can get some kind of benefit out of it, just click on the link below, become a paying subscriber, and you'll be able to participate in these twice a month. Okay, well, that's all I have to say. Let's jump right into the video. So with all that said, I'm going to go ahead and just get started. This week, we're talking specifically about growing a podcast. Before, we've done things like newsletters, subscriptions, how to grow an online community. But I do have a lot of podcasters who subscribe to my newsletter, and it's always a pain point for a lot of publishers, especially publishers that aren't like podcast native. They do something else and they run a podcast on the side, so they can't really devote their full attention. So, a few things I want to talk about is on this session eventually is like how to optimize your show notes or create like really good web article content for the web, so it's easier to find people through like SEO and social media, how to get other podcasters to promote your show, social media strategy for promoting your podcast, paid ad spend, so like actually buying ads on Facebook or other podcasts, and then how to optimize your website for your podcast. Like how do you create like a good landing page and stuff like that. So it's definitely like all kinds of things I'd love to cover. At some point we might not get to everything, but let's just kind of jump right into it. I want to talk to, maybe there's a guy on here named Brian McCullough. He has a hard stop at 3:00, so I wanted to maybe start with you, Brian. Brian, you run a podcast called The Tech Meme Ride Home. It's a daily podcast. It's incredibly successful. I think the last time we talked, you were getting like 50,000 downloads a day. Maybe it's north of that now. you kind of have like, I think you have a lot of experience and you've thought through a lot in terms of growing a podcast and using things like paid ad spend and
Mhm.
frequency. Can you talk about like your playbook? Like sometimes you'll actually like launch new podcasts on your network. What's a good playbook for when you're trying to bring on a new podcaster to basically ramp up their audience very quickly?
Well, so I don't know. I told you offline that I was going to do this, but I feel like I have a negative thing to say about it, in
Sure.
the sense that I'll just give the background real quick. I launched the Tech Meme Right Home 5 years ago now, and I licensed the brand Tech Meme. If people don't know, Tech Meme for years has been sort of the water cooler website for Silicon Valley. So all I did was license the brand and launch a podcast and do the same thing that Tech Meme does. And I also spent around $20,000 of my own money 5 years ago buying ads on other podcasts when that was easier to do. Everywhere from like The Verge to Kara Swisher's podcast. Again, 5 years ago you could actually afford to do that. Now they charge you like $80 CPMS and crazy stuff like that. But so I got my audience from zero to, let's call it 30,000, with that $20,000 investment. And so, as Simon knows, because we talked a few years ago about maybe him joining the network as well, we thought, okay, this is a model of doing daily podcasts that we can just replicate. Where if you can spend 20,000 buying ads on other shows to get to a 30,000 audience, that's pretty kind of plug and play. We launched about 3 years ago. We started Ride Home Media. We launched, I think, a total of 7 shows, of which 2 still exist.
Yeah.
Now, COVID happened in between that, et cetera, et cetera. But this is what I wanted to say, and I'm going to throw this out there to be negative at first. I'd love to hear other positive experiences. I don't know that buying ads on other shows works anymore. Again, my thesis when we started Ride Home Media was it was sort of just a plug and play sort of thing. So my 2 thoughts on it are: did that only happen because 5 years ago there was a window where podcasting wasn't saturated and I could get in? We tried it in different verticals, like daily gossip. We tried it in sports. We tried it in politics, this thing and that thing, and none of them really worked. And we spent 6 figures trying to launch shows, and it didn't work. The other theory that I have is that maybe secretly the brand of Tech Meme was the secret sauce, which would make sense if you look at how celebrities have been key to launching big podcasts now, because celebrities are essentially brands. And so I don't know. My overarching point and question is: can you leverage podcasting to launch podcasts anymore? I am not sure. And like I said, we've sort of retrenched with our company, and are eager to learn if there's other ways that people have to launch new podcasts.
Yeah, certainly like the daily aspect helped as well in terms of just like from what I'm taught from people I've talked to, the daily podcast is able to like generate a lot of momentum that a lot of like weekly podcasts. I'm having that right now where I only do 2 podcasts a month and I am not picking up any momentum. In fact, I'm experiencing a lot of audience churn, like from a perspective like, yeah, like you maybe the other podcasts weren't as successful, but do you feel like the daily cadence plays a big part?
Okay, that is something that I hadn't really thought about before, but we did launch about 2 months after the New York Times is the Daily. So I wonder
Okay.
if we also got caught up in the slipstream of that. Now, in between, the most successful thing that we did was when COVID started, we had the coronavirus daily podcast that went from zero to 80,000 listeners. But that was just because, again, were we in the right place at the right time? Like we got 20,000 listeners overnight just from people searching it in iTunes. Yeah, I don't know. Again, I'm here to say I thought that I had sort of a recipe for ginning up new podcasts that I could replicate over and over again, and I feel like that did not turn out to be true. So.
Yeah, I mean, you still have a tremendously successful podcast. It's just you've had a hard time replicating that model. I think maybe you're right that the tech meme, it had a 10, 15 year head start before you launched it, that it just had an amazing brand. I think you also experimented with, there was another blogger that you teamed up with, kind of
Mhm.
almost thinking through this whole like pre-existing brand thing. And I wonder if that, plays a role, and to kind of expand the learnings here, like a lot of people on this call have like coinciding media brands, so maybe they could use that more as a launching pad for in terms of launching a podcast with an already existing audience.
I think so. I'll say this, and then I'm happy to step back and let others go. But
Mhm.
if I was advising people right now, I would go in the opposite direction. I would say bring your brand from other channels, YouTube, newsletters, whatever, and think of the podcast as a value add, as an ancillary thing that's accretive, hopefully additional. But I maybe feel like it's harder to go from podcasts in the opposite direction now. But that's
Yeah,
just my experience.
yeah, I think like YouTube is definitely the biggest growth channel right now. I've definitely spent the last few months creating basically a YouTube companion for my podcast. I use Squadcast to record the episodes. I do a little bit of editing, and it's definitely increased my overall monthly download stream size. That's really where all the growth I've seen over the last month, even though it hasn't been that much. It's been on the YouTube side. So YouTube is like obviously such a huge platform. It has a huge internal search engine. So there are a lot of and then there's obviously like algorithmic
Discovery, yeah.
yeah, and stuff like that. It would probably be hard for you from a production perspective. I've seen how you produce your podcast every day, unless you hired an actual producer. Does anybody have any questions for Brian? He has a hugely successful podcast. He could definitely. Kathy, it looks like you
Yeah,
want to.
I was just going to say, I'd love to hear more details on how you monetize, Brian. I'm sure other people are interested in that as well.
Yeah.
Sure. It is entirely advertising based. When you do a daily show, you have a ton of inventory that you can sell. Interestingly, for 4 solid years, our inventory was always sold out. It's only in the last quarter that we've had our first real slowdown in ad inventory. I'd love to hear if other people have seen that as well.
Sure.
You asked the monetizing question. Uh, I apologize for this because I apologize for taking on this role. But what I did last year was I launched a venture capital fund. I literally, at the end of the show, one day said that if I did a rolling fund, would anybody invest? And overnight, I had 150 soft commits. Again, because of the audience, it's Silicon Valley based, et cetera, et cetera. So we now have a ride home fund that has $5 million in assets under management. And to be honest, I know this is on the record, but keep it between us as much as you can. But
I can't promise that, Brian.
I know, but
Okay.
I'm not afraid to say this. The podcast is in service of the fund now, in a lot of ways. I can still serve the audience and deliver news, but I'll make more money this year from running the fund than I will from podcasting.
And
Who
that
sells
means
your ads? Do you do it yourself?
We do get a lot of inbound again because of the industry we're in, but we also use AdvertiseCast for I'd say 70% of the inventory.
Thank you. It's fascinating.
and you did do paid subscriptions where it was like an ad-free version of the show, right? But you eventually abandoned that.
I haven't abandoned it because there are certain hardcore listeners that still subscribe to it, so
Uh,
I'm willing to do it. And that's the other thing is that again, in our space, weirdly, when I launched the ad-free version, the ad-free subscribers insisted that I still put the ads in the show notes because they're like, your ads are actually informative for us in the industry. So even though they pay to remove the audio part of the ads, they still want to see who's advertising because people get turned on to new. I see Jeremiah says that you're a TRH listener, which I appreciate. So yeah, everything does feed into each other now, but because what we do when I launched the fund is we now bring portfolio companies on for bonus episodes, and so it serves the portfolio companies as well because they get introduced to the audience. So even if people aren't invested in the fund, the audience can become vicariously fans of our companies as well.
And that's the Jason Calacanis role or strategy, right? Like,
Certainly, he was one of the first people to do. I mean, he's been doing podcasting and angel investing for 20 years now. So yeah.
yes. So he brings on founders and that gets him early investment deals and then he can promote it and it creates like a flywheel. You said it's your biggest revenue source. Is that just from the fees?
Yeah, basically. I mean,
Uh-huh.
obviously, talk to me in 10 years, and let's hope that I'm on a yacht somewhere because, right? But from fees from running the fund, and it's also a rolling fund. So as the audience churns, or as the audience grows, hopefully, I can also bring in new investors to the fund over time as well.
Yeah, and that's something that I think a lot of content creators don't think about is like, how do I use my content as lead generation? I certainly did this when I had my own content marketing consulting practice, is all my leads came in through my own content. And sometimes that can be way more lucrative than, a subscriber who's paying $100 a year. If you get one person who can pay you $60,000 in consulting fees, then that's a huge.
Certainly. And I want to just hit the subscriber thing as well because I think you and I have talked about this also. Is that the subscriber thing didn't work for me, and one of the investors in our company was a big believer in it, so that's why we tried it so hard. But in the end, I just could always make literally 20x, maybe even 30x what I make from subscribers by being ad supported. I don't know if other people have had similar experiences. I know some podcasts make so much, or at least the same that they do from ads, but our experience was not that at all.
Yeah. Stephanie, did you have a question for Brian?
Yeah, just wanted to know, you talked about, now the focus is, or you would suggest using, the podcast as an ancillary product or a value add and bringing in, already built in audiences from other aspects, whether it's, celebrity or newsletter or whatever it's, that
Yeah.
audience comes from. How have you seen the conversion rate from that audience? Because, moving them off of one platform into a completely different medium. Do you see, what have you seen audience wise of whether it's, a newsletter or it's a a celebrity that's on an actor or they're big on social? Where do you or how have you seen that convert over?
Yeah, so it's a complicated question because of the nature of running a fund, but I want to stress ancillary. If I use the wrong term, I apologize. None of this would exist without the podcast, because also the audience of the podcast is how I get my deal flow. It's people starting companies that have been listening to me for years that come to me when they launch their companies and be like, "Hey, be the first check into our round." Um, it's pure percentage, and so again, like if I got another 10,000 listeners this year, I can do the math and see and estimate how many people would invest in the fund. I can do the math and see how much deal flow, I get from the audience inbound of like 20 or 30 companies a week at this point. So I don't know that the one thing that if I could do it probably would be very big for us would be a newsletter, because again, people come to us for a quick 15-minute hit of what happened today. I can't, because of my nature with tech meme,
Yeah, I was just going to
do
say,
a
yeah.
newsletter because they are that and they actually have a newsletter product. So if I were independent, I would bet dollars to donuts that a newsletter would be huge for what I do.
Yeah, and there's a company called CityCast that's like pairing a daily newsletter with a daily podcast and that kind of way. And I think
Right.
that's
I
definitely
see Detroit, is it Detroit Daily, who I've always been a fan of, Daily Detroit, because I lived there for 5 years. So, there's, uh, if they want to speak to that as well in terms of like doing sort of a news
well.
cadence.
Yeah, well, before Jared, sorry, I would just want to go. Nico had a
Yeah.
question.
Oh, sure.
I,
Sorry.
I have kind of a stupid question, but what I know that it seemed like in the podcast industry for a long time, the primary metric was in terms of measuring audience growth was downloads, but it seems to be shifting to listens. And would love to hear from you and from anyone else on the call. How are you measuring audience engagement? Are there tools you're using that are really powerful for that? And because when we're trying to measure our audience growth, it's just I'm having a hard time.
I think downloads are the king still, because unfortunately the listens, it's just like haphazard. It's not like YouTube where it's like one central location. It's like these podcasts are going to all these different players which have different levels of analytics, and it's, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but downloads are probably still king.
I mean, my main metric is when I hit the desk every day at 8:30 in the morning, what did my previous day's episode do? And if it hits what I expect it to hit, then I know I'm still holding steady. If all of a sudden I've gained 1,000 over the last week, like literally, I am still doing again, I have a daily show, but like my 24-hour number is the number that is the most interesting to me in terms of knowing where I'm at.
Yeah. Before I move on to Jared, does anybody have any more questions for Brian? Okay, going once. Shauna? Oh,
So I don't have a question. I wanted to make a comment about,
sure.
so I have a weekly podcast and it's focused on rural Canadians. And so people, I have one sponsor, it's a chunk of money, and they're interested in where people are listening from. Not necessarily the downloads, they want to reach people. So they want to reach somebody in, pardon my French, but somewhere, in Ontario or Canada, or so if I can reach 460 communities, that sounds big to them. And that sounds like a wide thing, and they'll pay for that. I just want to make that comment.
Yeah, I mean, the best way to show that, I think, is through survey, trying to create ways to incentivize your audience to answer some kind of survey so that you can get survey data on that. I know that like some programmatic ad networks can pull IP data and stuff like that, but I don't know from analytics alone.
I'm on Art19, and at least they will geo-target within the DMA, the sort of radio or TV version of whatever. But yeah, I mean, certainly that's true for me too, FYI, because, my listeners are very coastal. Like 2/3 of our listeners are essentially in California, Washington State, and New York State. So, yeah.
Shauna, Buzzsprout gives you location level analytics, like by even county?
Town.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
Well, it's super valuable when you're trying to sell an ad to a rural internet provider.
Yeah, cool. Jer, you run a really popular local city-based podcast, and I think you have a newsletter component as well, Daily Detroit. The utility of yours is very clear. It's like local, listen to this podcast and you're up to date what's going on with the news. Like, how do you think about audience growth, and how do you, drive people to your podcast?
Well, I wanted to kind of back into a couple of questions that were asked. Number one, do a newsletter if you can. Absolutely. To kind of use a motor analogy, of course I do, from the Motor City, but an engine works with multiple pistons. So if you've got a newsletter and a podcast, they go chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. And then if there's other products you do, then you can add more cylinders to it. And as you fire up more cylinders, you will have more power. And
Jeremiah, do you reuse like your scripts from the show? Because like that's what 100%. I would imagine.
100%. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like I'll trim them down, or like sometimes there's scripts, for things to do, or if there is a conversation with someone, I'll grab some key points and I've summarized like news clips my entire career. So it takes me like 10 seconds to just be like, talked with them about this. And what's great about that.
Do you think of the newsletter as a separate product from the podcast, or the same product in a different format?
Oh, I think about them as serving different audiences because I know that they do, but I cross-pollinate both of them heavily. So when you think about what a newsletter does and the service that it does, I can fit more quick items in a newsletter really quick that maybe aren't really worth talking about on the podcast, like unpacking it all. It just doesn't make sense. But in a newsletter, I can be like, oh yeah, go check this thing out in downtown. And it would be like 3 sentences long, but it wouldn't really be worth discussion on the podcast. So I can add additional value on the newsletter. And it allows me to cover different stories in different ways. So yeah.
Do you feel that they're different audiences? Like, do you assume that everybody listens and reads, or do you think that maybe some people got introduced to one or the other and then gravitated to one or the other, but not both?
Exactly. I think there is a group of people who listen and read both. Absolutely. but they are entrance doors to each other. And that's why I use the engine concept, because that way you're able to create more, space when it comes to advertisers or memberships or all that kind of stuff. And there's some people who are they're going to want a newsletter and they don't want a podcast. It's just the facts, and vice versa. And so I learned that the two of them really work well together, and I'm really trying to turn up more newsletter to take advantage of that. Also with advertisers who aren't as familiar with podcasts, because I work in the local space, I'm not on the coast. There are people who are like, I'm not really a podcast person, but I understand what a newsletter is. It is always easy to walk into someone and be like, I have a newsletter. So if they don't know your podcast, the newsletter, they'll know, and it works together really well. It gets them interested. And setting up the newsletter as I do, where it's not just, hey, here's our episode today, it allows people to organically find bits where they wouldn't be like, oh, I'm just not into podcasts. I've had a lot of people who are like, I didn't know about the podcast. I wasn't sure, but I gave it a shot and now I'm hooked. And so you just got to kind of pull people together like that.
Yeah, and it's also like people consume podcasts at different times. They consume newsletters. Like the podcasts are like a lean back experience. Some days when they're commuting or something, they'll want to they'll be wanting to consume the podcast version, but on a day that they're working from home, they'll probably just want to read the newsletter version. So creating those two different things, like I definitely like the Colin Samir show is a great podcast. Sometimes when I'm just eating lunch and I need something to watch on YouTube, I'll watch one of their interviews on YouTube. But other times when I'm at the gym on the elliptical and I'm listening to podcasts, and I'll listen to the episode as a podcast. So you're giving them multiple venues that they can download, that they can like actually consume it, where they'll be consuming different versions on different days. Same thing with like the advertising. Kind of to your point, like I've noticed that a lot of my advertisers for the newsletter, because the podcast advertisements are I charge a lot less for those, a lot of times they'll just buy up a bunch of newsletter ads, and then they'll just tack on a bunch of podcast sponsorships on top of that as like, extra gravy, I found. So it's good in terms of cross-pollinating advertisers as well.
For sure. I want to double down on the survey thing. Super crucial, because yes, you can get location data and it's gotten better and better, but there is something about people raising their hands and knowing like kind of where they're at. Like I even gave them the opportunity to share like what suburb or Detroit neighborhood that they're in. And I'm not able to screen share, but I actually pulled up, like, I know which county, what percentage of people in which county. I know self income demographics, all those kind of things, and knowing even like where they came from and how they discovered the newsletter. Do a survey once you get a little bit of audience, because it will tell you amazing things, and to leave a space for people to share their own stories, because you're going to learn so much about how they consume the show. Like, do a survey, do it every year. It is invaluable information. Then as to analytics, I'm sorry I'm going on. Actually, I use 2 and 2. So the downloads are still king, but those individual Spotify or Apple Podcast analytics are really useful for the engagement metric. So if you're looking at your show and you're wondering maybe if somebody like what worked and what didn't, you can go in there and you can see the little graph. And even though it's just a subsection, right? Your Spotify listeners aren't all your listeners. Maybe your Apple Podcast listeners aren't all your Apple Podcast listeners. That engagement data will be like, oh, that's where they booked out, or, oh, that topic didn't do really well. And that will really help you use data to craft your content, even though it doesn't give you a 100% picture of all your listeners.
Yeah, I'm always too horrified to look at those graphs. But I know YouTube has like really granular analytics, and so the best YouTubers definitely study those obsessively to see the exact point that they completely fall off. Kind of continuing on the theme of creating web content, Jared, you did a newsletter. Kathy, I know that you run the Macmillan Podcast Network. You have something called the Quick and Dirty Tips website, which is like a really an amazing case study into how to build a website around podcasts and how to convert podcast scripts into articles. What are some of the things you've found that's been really effective on that front?
Well, I should say Mignon Fogarty, who's also on this call, is actually the founder of that incredible website. We not only is it an issue of allowing the podcast content to be accessible, right, to people who perhaps are hearing impaired or deaf, but it is just really great way to cross-pollinate. For a long time, revenue generation came largely from the website. before podcasting really took off. So it was a revenue generator for us as well. It's a great way too. The website allows the hosts to be able to offer bonus content in a way that's perhaps not premium based, subscription based, that people don't have to pay for. But Monica Reinagel, our nutrition diva, could be talking about a food, and she can direct people to the website for, the research data that she's referring to. She can direct people to the website for a recipe, whatever it is. We also use the website, Mignon, right, to develop educational materials for teachers, right? So we can compile topic-based content for teachers in the classroom to leverage the incredible content that Grammar Girl has. So there's lots and lots of ways to extend the reach of the podcast onto the website. And there's also an incredible value, we think, in providing transcripts and content from interviews and podcast hosts on the website, and they work really beautifully synergistically. I'm not as involved in the day-to-day anymore, and I know, Mignon, they just made some pretty significant changes to the website. I don't know if you want to speak to that and what that has done for us so far.
Sure. Yeah, like we haven't really seen, so we redesigned the website and made it even more mobile friendly and things like that. We also cut back on a lot of the content that hadn't been performing well in search. So we pared it down to keep only the best performing pages from search and social. And we're going much more podcast forward. We think, SEO is becoming harder and harder. And, we think podcasts are where the growth is still. And so we're highlighting, one, everything Jeremiah said, absolutely. Two, they are completely different. I believe they're largely different audiences. People come to our website through search. They're looking for an answer to a question. Someone who listens to a podcast is looking more for a laid back experience, wanting to engage, learn at their own pace, at slow time. And so although there's definitely overlap and they work together and you can drive people from the podcast to the website and people come to the website and they go to the podcast, there's never been as much coming to the website and going to the podcast as we might have hoped. And, all the time I hear people, when I meet people out in the world, they will say, oh, I always come to your website. And then I didn't know you had a podcast. And so we're trying to fix that with the redesign and putting the podcast even more, it's right at the top of every page, but still people didn't see it because that's not what they're looking for. So, I think any chance you can get to get your podcast up there higher is going to obviously help the podcast.
Yeah,
I think too that we've generated a lot of revenue from just having those transcripts. We've actually licensed them to learning companies, right? In conjunction with integrating the podcast into the player on the page. But there's a lot of you can find some really interesting ways. You can also take transcripts from your website and syndicate them to like-minded publications, right? So we have a Savvy Psychologist show where we do syndication on Scientific American, on Psychology Today, and all the major websites where there's we don't allow syndication unless they link back to the podcast. So it's a great way to show, oh my gosh, this person is an incredible expert on social anxiety. I want to hear her podcast now. So there's a lot of synergy there.
Yeah, one of my friends, Jackie Schiff, I was hoping she could to attend today, but I guess she had a conflict. She actually owns an agency that specializes in taking things like podcast episodes, and she has a team of writers, and they convert them into very high quality articles for websites. And she and I were chatting the other day, and she was like, actually, we found that it doesn't really drive audience to the podcast at all, but it's still worth it because it's an additional way to build an audience for the website to monetize or drive leads and stuff like that. So she basically, long story short, is she said, even if it isn't generating more downloads for the podcast, it's still worth doing because there's a lot of other monetization stuff that you're losing out on. In fact, I've seen a lot of podcasts, they don't bother doing this, and then other writers do. There's some writers who have had a ton of traffic on Medium because they go and listen to these long form interviews with these famous startup founders, and then they'll take that interview and write an article about, here are the key learnings I learned, and they'll generate a lot of traffic. So it seems like there's a lot of value in trying to create to get more repurposing of your content, even if it's not driving, as you said, Mignon, a lot of actual downloads to the podcast itself.
Hey, Simon, just a quick question. How do you know, and Mignon too, what is the data? I mean, maybe there's just no increase in downloads ever, but there's some attribution you're assuming there. And I'm just curious what it is that you see that you're not. My assumption is that actually understanding, as we talked about, like the data that's actually available for podcasts and podcast listeners is so opaque that I imagine it'd be quite hard to even know if someone had like started on a website and then was later downloading and listening to the podcast anyway.
Yeah, and just for context, Pete is a former BBC producer and now runs his own kind of podcast type company. I think Mignon and Kathy can speak to this, but it's just like with me, I could just see, articles really take off, but no kind of correlating jump in podcast downloads, or it's kind of like a depressing landscape right now in terms of podcast growth. It seems like the entire podcast audience is growing, but the trickle down effects aren't really helping all that much. Kathy, did you have something to say?
I mean, there are definitely some services like Chartable that you can use where you can do a customizable link. You can submit the article with a customizable link back to the podcast landing page where you have a variety of players that you can choose from, and you can actually track that way. So there are some services out there. They're not perfect by any stretch, but they can be really helpful in terms of giving you some transparency into where the traffic is coming from.
Yeah, I might be an outlier here, but I think I've never ever clicked on a link. Like I would always just go to the search within my podcast app to like go find something. So from an attribution point of view, I imagine that data is like super. But Simon, your point, which is like you see an article blow up and you don't see the downloads blow up, that makes a ton of sense.
And if you see your podcast reference in an article and you already have a podcast player, right? You use Apple Podcasts or whatever, chances are you're just going to go look it up on there. You're not necessarily going to click. So you're right.
Yeah. I mean,
I just want to jump in with another tool on Podsites. You can actually create not just a link, but an IP tracker. So you can track people who've come to your website and then have listened to the episode, and they will tell you that data. It's a little bit more complicated on the back end, but you can do that so you can track the IP addresses.
What's Podsites?
Podsites is another attribution tool, just like similar to Chartable. So you can track campaigns. If you're running ads on other podcasts, you can see how well they're doing. And they allow you to put not just the links to track it, but you can track the IP addresses to see how many people heard your ad and then came back and listened to your podcast from that. You can put it if you're running a campaign with a website that's you're driving clicks to, like if you have, your podcast.com/ whatever your code is, whatever your name is on the back end, you can actually track how many people listened to that ad and then came back and went to that website. They have a lot of really cool things that you can do. If you have an app that you're trying to, promote to in your ads, you can put a tracker in that says, how many people listened to the ad and then how many people came in and downloaded that app. So it's a little bit more involved, a little bit more expensive than Chartable. But if you are looking for those tools, they are available there in Podsites.
Yeah. One thing that I've always heard is that there's a lot of benefit to being part of a network because the best way to grow a podcast is to have it mentioned on other podcasts. Mignon and Kathy, you have this huge network of various podcasts. Like, is there like a strategy in place for inserting like maybe unsold ad inventory or something like that, like plugs for other podcasts to try to cross-pollinate that?
I was going to say we specialize in that. Yeah.
I was going to say Kathy probably has a lot to share about this. Particularly,
Sure.
She launched 2 really successful shows. The Driving the Green Book, and I bet people would love to hear about that.
I mean, it's our whole strategy, right? For many years, I called it the Greater Good Initiative because not only were we surfacing one show on another show, but we do exactly what you just said, Simon. Any unsold ad inventory, right, goes to either an audiobook within our network or a print book like a Grammar Girl book, or it goes to promoting, a special mini-series that's running on another show. I mean, we get a couple million downloads per month. We have 400 million lifetime downloads in our vast archive of 5,000 plus episodes. We try to really eke out every possible impression, whether it's for a Macmillan author or another host on all of that. It is a deeply ingrained strategy within the podcast team. And I think one that has really worked beautifully. We yield millions of impressions for, not just for our authors, but mostly for our podcast hosts to cross promote. That, is the beauty of having a network, really.
And would you recommend, if someone isn't lucky enough to be part of a network, to try to manufacture that in some other way, like maybe trying to network with other podcasters and doing recommendation swaps and stuff like that? Or do you think that wouldn't be very effective?
Oh, I think that would be incredibly effective, and we do that too. There's people on the team that reach out to other like-minded shows, and we're constantly recommending, even like, Stephanie and I know each other through some projects we've worked on together. We're constantly saying, hey, try this show, try that show, look at this audience, look at this new show. I mean, I think that cross-pollination, we're still in an environment where there's co-opetition as opposed to total competition. And I think other networks, like we've even reached out to Wondery and some of the major networks and had great success with doing swaps and, bartering and co-swapping ad inventory as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a great strategy and one everybody should be employing to grow audience.
Kathy,
Great.
is there a good place to see your network? Is there go on Macmillan?
quickanddirtytips.com or Macmillan Podcast, but the primary nonfiction network that Mignon founded is quickanddirtytips.com. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
It was like the first original, really successful collaboration with a mainstream media company that, this was the Quick and Dirty Tips was like the OG podcast network, and from a Macmillan Publishers it was a big risk for them because podcasts weren't that big back then. So it took a lot of foresight for them to see the potential podcast for them to go all in on that early, I think.
Thank you. Largely thanks to Mignon.
And
Yes.
so they when I met the people there, I knew they instantly got it. They had a digital initiative. I was looking for a partner. They were looking to do something digital. It was like the perfect fit. It was so great.
Yeah. Stephanie, I know I read, you and I were chatting a little bit while people were coming in. I remember reading a case study or something, an interview with you recently. You helped grow, was it a fiction podcast to 1 million downloads or something like that recently?
It was a fiction podcast. So I work for Kurtco Media, which is a smaller network, and we launched our first scripted fiction earlier this year, and had not dived into fiction at all before. And we launched, and within the first 3 months had 1 million downloads. Very fortunate. It was greatly, we got great feedback within the industry and from the listeners. And it was a really good learning experience. And, one of the ways that we grew that audience were ads on other podcasts. And I know that it was talked about earlier, is it still successful to do that? Is it still worth it? And yes and no. I think if you can find that niche audience that really resonates with your audience, a similar one, then it can be very beneficial. But does it get expensive? Yes, because how many impressions do you want? What is the conversion rate? So for example, we ran 2 separate campaigns, almost identical, same ad spend, same ad creative, same amount of impressions, on 2 separate networks. One was a completely fiction network and one was a nonfiction network, a very popular nonfiction network, and ran them at the same time. Now, we launched a fiction show and we're promoting a fiction show, and the fiction campaign was a 5% conversion rate. So that means 5% of people who heard the ads on the other podcast came back and listened to ours. On the nonfiction side, it was a 0.5% conversion rate. So very different. So it really depends, so one could, if you just ran one, you would either look at it and be like, this was insanely successful because industry standard is about 1% conversion rate. And if you just ran the other one, would say this was a huge waste of money. So it really depends on where you're looking at. And so that was really eye-opening for us and how we want to spend money moving forward, and really focus on not trying to reach with outside of our audience, stick where we know that these listeners want the content and get in front of those listeners.
And did you choose podcast by podcast you wanted to advertise on that for fiction, or was it a programmatic ad buy, or how did you locate the podcast to try to advertise on?
So within this network, we split it. We did half on their new releases because fortunately they were releasing around the same time, and half on their back catalog. It was about half the conversion rate on their back catalog as it was on their new releases. So what did that tell us? From our standpoint, it was people who are listening to new shows want more content. They want to be searching for what's coming out and what's new. But that we still got conversions from the back catalog. It just was not as high of a conversion rate. And we found that about 4 times was the frequency rate to get someone to convert. So it's something to keep in mind. So whether it's your newsletters or your podcast or whatever it is, that 4 times of people hearing it was that perfect conversion rate for us.
And did you create a trailer, or how did you, what's the way to pitch? I don't know anything about fiction podcasts. I don't listen to any. So this is all different.
Yeah. And it is totally a different animal, coming
Yeah.
from an always on, interview style, chat style show, going into fiction, it's a whole other beast. So for us, we know that in the industry that host-read ads generally perform better because the audience, is invested in the host and what they're saying. But for fiction, we found it was better for us to produce our own ads. And if the networks that we were promoting on were comfortable with that, to give them, a 30-second to 60-second pre-produced ad that they could just drop in. Now, some networks were like, great, we'll just drop it in. Some thought it would be a little jarring with their shows. So they did, like a 5 or 10 second intro before they let it in. Like, if you like our show, you'll love this. Here's a new show, something like that to make it less jarring for the listeners. But either way, it still way outperformed on the fiction networks and fiction shows.
Well, certainly it wasn't all paid ad spend to get to 1 million downloads. There must have been some word of mouth or something.
Lots of word of mouth. About 2 years of word of mouth. It took us 2 years to fully make the show. So we'd been talking about it for a while, and just really, making friends and talking to the community, and especially, fiction is such a niche part of the industry. So talking to other creators and what's coming out for you and how can we work together, and what makes it different? Why are we releasing it? We were also very fortunate that we had some big names attached to it. So that helped a lot, that the platforms got interested in it. The industry got interested in it. It was right. We had Stephanie Beatriz, who was exploding, right at that same time. So we were very fortunate with that. And that does help. But I think, we dived in with the whole Solar team, went in, on Reddit, on Discord, on socials, and researching, sci-fi fans and audio dramas, and getting into that community and really becoming a part of it versus just listen to my show, this is new, if that makes sense. Like, we really spent the 2 years immersing ourselves into the fiction community as a whole, into the sci-fi community. So that, because we want to continue creating content for it, so that you're talking to other people instead of at them.
So I wrote a newsletter recently about how, for the vast majority of publishers, narrative podcasts just aren't worth the investment. I was speaking to like nonfiction narrative, but obviously fiction is that, fits in that same category as well. And one of my arguments is it's such a short run of episodes, and plus, like, you can't predict ahead of time what the audience size is, so it's really hard to get advertisers on board and monetize. How did you overcome some of those limitations so that those million downloads actually mattered?
Well, one, those are all very good points that we're still trying to figure out in the fiction side of this, of how do you make it, monetary, or how do you optimize the monetization of it? Because it does take more time to produce them. It does take more money to produce them. They are limited series. So we incorporate a lot of other value adds, and I do this with other platforms, other shows, other networks. If we can't provide it in the downloads right away, how else can we provide value? So it was, can we create social ads that promote our brands that are advertising on us as well to help get to those impressions? Can we send it out in a newsletter? We bought, when the Ambies came out, they did an insert in the Hollywood Reporter. And so we did an ad that surrounded the insert that was all about the Ambies. And we promoted our advertisers there as well to add value there, because, we couldn't guarantee our numbers. Here's what we expect. Here's what other fiction podcasts have done, but it's our first one out of the gate. So how else can we provide value? Can we do live events that you're sponsoring, and create a whole package for it? And that's whether you're going out to other shows, if you don't have the same amount of downloads that you're trading with. Can you do a shout out in your newsletter that has more listeners? Can you do a social post? How can you create extra added value so that everyone's winning from it?
Does anybody else have any questions for Stephanie? I want to kind of open this up a little bit and zoom out a little bit more. We got lots of podcast talent on here. We've got Per Grangfist, we got Brian, we got Pete Davies, we got several people who do some kind of professional podcasting. Let's talk in general about, like, some issues coming up. Per, you had a question about the Spotify's video tool, which they had in beta for a while, and now I think they're rolling it out to the larger ecosystem. You want to set up the question and we can maybe discuss it?
I think that was Tamika who said that in the chat.
Oh, was it Rick? I'm sorry. I'm
Rick.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
That was me. Yeah, I just wanted to know, Spotify's been pushing a lot. Spotify, it seems like they're pushing people to upload their videos as podcasts. And I feel like we've heard stats that people like watching podcasts. And is this a valid growth, more not a monetization channel, but is it a valid growth channel?
Yeah. And Tamika, do you want to just give us a 1-sentence bio just so people know who you are?
Oh, hi. Yes. Hey guys, I'm Tamika Key. I'm a content marketer in the ad tech space. But I want to launch my own media company that has to do with spirituality and technology and all across all the platforms. And so, yeah, that's that's me.
Cool. Yeah, so like I think Mignon can speak a little bit to utilizing video, but I'll just give my little spiel a little bit. I don't think I read a lot of case studies on media. I haven't seen a lot of stuff about Spotify in general and how their video product, which is still relatively new, is performing. But I'm sure they're taking the lead from YouTube, where we're seeing some of the most popular podcasts in the world right now, especially the newer ones that are really popular, is that they have some kind of video or YouTube component. Whenever I tell that to people, they think I'm crazy. Like, who would want to watch a podcast? But I'm 38 years old. I remember when the Howard Stern, there was like a syndication on like the E network or something like that, and me as like a teenager would stay up late watching basically a video recording of Howard Stern recording his call. It's like, and you think of any kind of talk show or cable news show or anything like that, they're basically just podcasts with talking heads. There's something about the act of watching someone speaking, watching their facial expressions, that adds like some kind of like actual add some kind of enhancement to the actual consumption of the podcast. Mignon, you've been experimenting not with Spotify video, but with like TikTok and Instagram video and stuff like that. What has your experience been there?
Right. I've been spending an extraordinary amount of time on video lately. I believe it's important. I believe it's probably the future, and most podcasters are going to have to do it. I don't have a lot of data on it, but I actually did think people might like to hear about a big social media campaign I did about a year ago. Kathy was a big part of this. It was for the 15th anniversary of the Grammar Girl podcast. So we had a newsworthy event, and I did a month-long social media campaign. I posted an audio link every day for a month to all my social media channels with a custom written, crafted for that platform only teaser. And I engaged with every post and every comment. And, we were able to grow the traffic for a long established show, 15th anniversary, we grew traffic 20% in a month through this intense social media campaign. It is 100% not sustainable. You cannot do that like every day, every year. But I think it's incredible. What I learned is that it's really, really worth maybe once a year or maybe twice a year, finding something you can make a big deal about to your followers and just promote the heck out of your podcast, for an intense period of time. And it moved the needle more than almost anything else I've seen.
Yeah. And
Did you find that traditional media coverage, like a newspaper write-up or a radio spot, do you have any sense about the value of those in terms of driving
only if
audience
they're
growth?
really big? Only if they're really big.
Like Oprah.
Yeah. Like if you could a top 10 podcast list in the New York Times or something like that, that'll move the needle. Everything else is just tiny and incremental. But doing that big social media push did get me like 5 or 6 regional radio interviews, people just coming to me not even trying, they see it and then they approach you. So it all really builds together.
Simon, you asked Mignon what she was doing on TikTok and Instagram. I'd be really curious, Mignon, about what you're doing on TikTok in particular.
Yeah, I'm just making short language videos. And so I built a pretty big following there. I've got about 30,000 followers. I've had some videos get 500,000 views. As far as I can tell, it's not doing anything for the podcast. It's very hard to move people from TikTok to anything else, from what I understand. And if it sounds even remotely promotional, they don't show it to anyone. So I've taken to pinning the first comment in the TikTok video that refers people to my podcast. My link in bio is to my podcast. I feel like I'm building a following there. I'm building the brand for sure, which is always something that I think has value, even if it's not driving to the podcast. But I'm not seeing a direct relationship between TikTok and
when you say link, the link in bio is to the podcast, do you have a special kind of landing page? And
I use Linktree, so it actually, I can have 5 or 6 links. So I have the link to the podcast and then my books and my courses and everything.
And for the TikTok, are you like you're just like picking a grammatical rule, like you and just saying, like, explaining the grammatical rule, maybe having like a little bit of graphics on it, but it's mainly your face to the camera?
Exactly. It's super informal. It's really quick. It might be something that came up in the podcast that week. More likely it's something someone asked me or just something that struck me that I could talk about while I'm out walking in the park that I can do off the top of my head. It's very quick. So that's one of the good things about it.
Yeah. Tamika, I know we didn't answer your question about Spotify, but did that help at all? Oh,
I can speak for Spotify in the sense that the people I know that I'm in Stockholm, Sweden, so we're fairly close to Spotify here. I mean, they run
everybody in Sweden works at Spotify, right?
Exactly. And they've been a client of ours as well. So they run a bunch of experiments, and I don't think they have a video strategy. I think that, I mean, everyone's going video, why not? And they have the tools to do it. But generally speaking, we run a network of podcasts. We have 6 podcasts of our own brand. And what we tried in the last few weeks is just to sort of what type of things you need to do to increase the number of listeners. And you ask Spotify and they have no idea. There's a lot of experts out there. Nobody has any idea how to do it. It might work in your case, and then you have to figure it out. And we did. We have 175,000 subscribers to our newsletter. So we did a big push 3 times in 1 week. And then we were able to increase our listeners by 50%. And so around a 1% conversion rate we had. But that is from email to podcast. And now we're doing the second push, which is going to other podcasts and doing ads. We use Acast. They have a network. We also use Spotify's own advertising to see where we can do hyper targeting, much the way that Stephanie said, doing the exact same audience and then trying to find other podcast that has it. So we'll see where that goes. And then the next thing we're going to do in 2 weeks is actually to do paid endorsements. And so we can actually have a sample of what is driving traffic and then monitoring everything. And we have no idea how it goes, but it's the same thing that you were saying. I mean, you have to ask people a lot of time. Here's the podcast. Every morning we do something on Instagram stories. We have a podcast, and then we will get into our customer service. Oh, I wish you would have any podcasts. Have you thought about that? And we're like, yeah, sort of. It's the same thing about some subscription. The only thing you get people subscribe is ask them to subscribe for a lot of times. And then eventually they will say, yeah, sure.
Yeah. And I get the sense of with Spotify that it has a huge podcast audience, but it's a very kind of, for lack of a better word, normie audience. Like if you have a B2B podcast, it's not going to do, nobody's going to Spotify to listen to a B2B podcast. They want like celebrity or news driven type podcasts. So if you have like a more niche podcast, you're probably not going to perform very well on Spotify. Brian Colburn, you run some podcasts, you're nodding your head. Anything you want to add?
You know what? First of all, thank you everybody for your time today. I've taken copious amounts of notes over here. One thing that we've started
can you give a 1-sentence bio for who
I
you
sure
are?
Can. Sorry. My name is Brian Colburn. I run Sitch Radio out of Irvine, California. We're a podcast production house. We help a lot of solopreneurs, entrepreneurs in the local area. We have a few large companies that we serve as well. A lot of the shows, what we started doing is just keeping these audiences in the silos that they're in. You know, some shows have a massive Facebook group and it's so hard to migrate them over to the podcast and vice versa. So what we did is just figured out ways to monetize each silo to generate enough revenue to keep that podcaster going, to offset production costs, to put a little money in their pocket. And that's worked really well. One show that we had, we started doing monthly webinars where we would invite a pretty well-known speaker in that niche in, but we would sell sponsorships for that show, and signing up for that webinar, they would give us permission to share their contact information with those sponsors. And that by far, that was, 80% of annual revenue was just those 1-hour webinars monthly. It was ridiculous. So,
and you were using the podcast to promote the webinars?
Podcast, newsletter, social channels, driving everybody to the opt-in page for the webinar. And that webinar was incredible.
Yeah. And sorry, keep on going.
I was just going to say the amount of work it takes to put together a webinar, even with a few sponsors and the graphics and assets and all of that, is next to nothing producing a podcast week after week.
Yeah, and you can cross-pollinate those things. I didn't ask Brian McCullough about this when he was on. I meant to, but he had to jump off. Is he actually uses Twitter Spaces, which is kind of like a webinar type live audio thing, and he'll have experts on. He's had me on a few times, and it'll be a live discussion like a webinar. But then he'll take the recording of that and distribute it on the Tech Meme Ride, the Ride Home podcast feed as like bonus content, that weekend or whatever, and then he'll be able to sell some additional ad inventory. And for your sponsor, you can pitch it as, oh, we'll give you even additional exposure on our main podcast feed as well.
Simon, 2 new sessions for you, one on social audio and one on video. We could have entire conversations about those 2 topics as well.
Yeah, I need to find some people who are doing video podcasts really well. I watch a few, and I need to pitch them on coming on, but that's a really good idea.
Just one quick point on that. The biggest challenge for us, and why we haven't really put much effort into it, Mignon has, but the rest of the hosts haven't, we can't monetize the same way at this point. We're with Midroll, Stitcher, and they won't count those impressions. So for us, that's been a barrier to entry in terms of doing something really important with video.
Per, were you going to say something?
Adding to what Brian said on keeping people on platform, we just launched the Apple channel on the Apple podcast. So you have a channel for your podcast, and then we market the hell out of one of the podcasts, and then suddenly all podcasts sort of started to rise because they can find it. We also harmonize our graphic across the entire all the podcasts, also sort of increased it. So work where you are on the one channel and don't try to drive into another channel seems to be the key here.
Yeah, so you're saying, and I'm not as familiar with this, but Apple Podcasts, now that they've lost subscriptions, they have these things called channels where all the same podcasts within the same network are grouped together somehow within the app, and that somehow is driving listenership across your different podcasts, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's correct. So they find trust in one podcast, and this actually looks like they're basically the same from the same publisher, so I'll go listen to that as well.
Yeah. Kathy, to your point about the monetization, certainly not on Instagram or TikTok or anything like that. But if you can get your podcasters up to that 1,000 subscriber threshold, you can get into the YouTube partnership program, and they'll start running automatic programmatic ads on your podcast. It won't be like your main source of revenue, but in terms of like some ancillary revenue or whatever, you can probably, see some of that, I believe. Okay, well, we're starting to kind of wind down at the end of the hour. Anybody, I'll just throw this out there, and if there's anything anybody wants to talk about, any questions you have for the group, you obviously have a lot of podcast talent on here. Feel free to throw out a question or two. Just gonna give it a few seconds.
I'm curious for Kathy and Mignon, to what extent do you have how big are your teams? How much resource does it take to do the range of activities that you're talking about?
Pretty
so
big
for the network, there's 3 freelance audio producers. They're more like engineers. I think each one of our hosts has some level of competency in terms of the way that they handle their recordings. When we bring new hosts on, we give them extensive training, voice training, all that stuff, so they can do a lot of the heavy lifting themselves. Our shows are pretty straightforward. They don't require really high production values, so we're lucky in that respect. There's a social media marketing person, there's an ad coordinator, there's an editor.
So you kind of in the backside, you have got one social media person who's working across all of the shows?
That is correct, but they do it in conjunction with each individual host. So they coordinate. Mignon can speak to that better than I can, but they coordinate together.
It varies from host to host. I do almost all my own social media, but they help. Our social media person, helps market the courses and webinars and does more promotion for some of the other hosts.
But that's great. One FTE can handle 10 shows, basically, are you saying?
Social isn't the major way we promote, really. Some of the hosts have very small social media followings, so it's not as big of a lift as you might think. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
I probably put 5 to 8 hours a week into my social media.
Yeah, Mignon does a lot.
Thanks,
yeah,
Mignon.
Yeah, you've really been doubling down on like Instagram and stuff like that. I've noticed lately. I'm noticing it. Yeah, if people ask me if you start generating enough revenue to hire someone, who would you hire? I think my first hire would be a freelance producer of some sort, someone who can help me take my podcast and the video version of the podcast to the next level, because I have some very rudimentary editing skills, but I think someone could definitely up that production value just a little bit more and take some of that time off my plate so I can, focus on the stuff that I'm good at. Anybody else before we wind down? Going once, going twice. JB looks.
Well, I was interested in the earlier discussion about repurposing transcripts. I just wanted to know if there was anything else there that we haven't discussed in terms of just creative ways to take the raw content from those transcripts and using them for, like, we've been talking about maybe for our company, there have been a couple times where in the interview, we have a client on and the client says something very nice about working with us. It's not necessarily the most interesting thing to have in the final cut of the episode, but we could see it as a client testimonial, like a pull quote or something you put on the website. I was just curious if there, what are the range of ways that you all have used the content from transcripts for other purposes?
Yeah, I think like utilizing the silent video play on a lot of, and if anybody does have to leave, I won't be offended if you have to leave early, but I'll keep on going a little bit longer. Using the advantage of silent video play on like Instagram, Facebook, Instagram stories and stuff like that, pairing the transcripts with some kind of either static image or video or something like that, because a lot of people are going to be scrolling through their feed and might not have their sound on. I don't know, like you said, like creating blurbs, like having a good headshot of your guest with whatever their blurb is, and like really good, well-designed text and stuff like that. Does anybody else have any? Brian, do you do any of this for your clients that you produce with?
When somebody always proofs an AI transcript, and as they're proofing it, we'll pull what could be tweets, tweet threads. If a question is asked, that will be a tweet or a social post linking back to that episode. So that's done during the proofing process of a transcript. And I mean, for a 30-minute episode, it's easy to pull 15, 20 pieces of content. And at the moment, it's a copy paste. So those lists get built out while we're proofing the transcript.
Yeah, and I don't have nearly the time to do this, but taking the best like 3 minutes of audio from, this isn't transcripts, but the best 3 minutes of audio and making clips for like TikTok or YouTube or different things like that, and basically breaking down the interview into its component parts and creating little tangential social media pieces that you can constantly be dripping out and stuff like that. Some of the more advanced podcasters I've seen do that.
And we use it a lot, like we have a car show. And so if we're talking about the same type of cars and want it in different episodes, but want to do a blog post about these specific cars, we can pull transcript quotes from each of those episodes and have a whole new blog post pulling from these transcripts that, maybe having like what's going on with BMW, where does it come from? And we can pull from 5 different episodes versus just having it live on that one episode's page.
Yeah. Anybody else want to bring anything up? Pete, anything you've been dying to know about?
No, I found this super helpful and really interesting. I would say just a theme from like early on that I thought was that I observed and was just kind of mentioned because I've sort of been thinking about it over the last half hour, is that we've talked a lot about how like the transcript's a good example of how podcast content can like become repurposed to go generate like other assets that allow for discoverability. But it sounds like there's a real barrier then from that, like whether it's TikTok or whether it's a website or a blog or anything, to actually then go drive like downloads and listens like in the podcast stick directly. And something I've been thinking about a lot is the concept of modality of just like we're in listening mode, we're in like browsing on the phone and kind of script like reading mode. And like, I think crossing between those two things is for all the openness of podcasts, it's one of the really big challenges is like figuring out how we can like make those two things. How can we help people when they're in one mode cross over to like, so the podcast is there like when they're in listening mode? And it's an interesting problem and something that my belief and my hope is that we're going to find that short audio is going to become more of a thing that enables much better discovery and kind of leading into those things. And so this is really helpful for me to think about as we're thinking about the role of short audio in this ecosystem.
Yeah, and certainly some people have been trying to solve what you're talking about on the audiobook side. There's an app called, it was called Serial Box. I don't know what it is now, but it's like serialized storytelling, and it's really easy to flip back and forth from the audio versions to the written versions. I think Amazon also has something with the Kindle or integration with Kindle and Audible that can switch back and forth. So, you know, as you're moving between different Oh, Mignon says it's Realm. Yeah, I think that's correct. As you're moving to different, when you're moving from your couch to your car, you know, switching between those things. So that's definitely something that, yeah, I think I think there's a market out there for something like that.
And also just figuring out how to promote the audio content within other audio content. And I think or those platforms. I think like Simon, last time we were talking, you or someone had mentioned how in Overcast there's the ads like to promote other podcasts. Like you're actually in a podcast app. It's the best place. Like someone's got the podcast app open. That's where they're going to be looking at it. I'm sure the rates are crazy to be there because it's like such an obvious place to go be. And I think as we can create as builders as well as like creators, like the more places we can allow people to actually discover things when they're like in the right mode, it's going to help a ton.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of companies, including Spotify, are trying to crack that code right now. Is like, how do we do podcast recommendations? It's just so hard because like TikTok, you only have to sample like 5 seconds of a video to decide whether you want to keep doing it. But like most podcasts, it takes 10 minutes of banter before you even know if this is something you're interested in. So I think TV or podcasts are more akin to like books, where there's always going to be a more kind of word of mouth kind of aspect to it than a algorithmic recommendation. But anyway, well, I think that's all we have for you guys today. Thank you so much for attending this. This is a lot of fun. This is probably my favorite part of every month. The 2 of these I do a month because it's really cool to see people. I sit in an office every single day, and the only interactions I have are like phone calls. So to be able to like sit in this like room with several other people, it's a lot of fun. So I hope to see people on future versions of these. I look forward to them, and definitely don't hesitate to reach out in the future if you have any questions, or if you want to suggest something, or if you have, or if like, let's say I send out an announcement that it's going to be about a certain topic, and you can think of someone who would be a really good feature guest. Like Stephanie was recommended by Kathy, and Kathy said that Stephanie would have a lot of cool stuff to say. So I told Kathy to please invite her. So if you see me send out an announcement, you think somebody would be great for that, either email me or just forward the invitation to them for them to log in, because I definitely email me too, so I know to call on them and ask them. But yeah, anyway, let me go ahead and stop the recording. Stop the recording.